What's up, y'all? This is Caption, aka Caption Red, and I'm the host of the Young Legends podcast. I hope you're doing great wherever you are. And what I'm doing right now is I'm taking a break from my regular scheduled programming to address an issue that I think is very important and needs to be discussed and needs to have light shined on it. So, first off, I want to say I am very sad about all the things that have been happening in our country. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. The fact that these things continue to happen is just heartbreaking. And I can't imagine what it's like to be African American right now, but I imagine it's just so tough. So as I get into this conversation, I first off want to say that I support the police. I know there's some bad ones out there. I know that we need to get rid of the bad ones. But also, like the education system, I think that the police and the entire criminal justice system needs to be overhauled. And I'll talk more about that later. As I say this, I want to say that I'm still learning. My main hope, besides educating and informing, is that I don't say anything that's offensive or hurtful. Now, I have done a lot of research on these topics. I by no means am an expert. And I am by no means perfect with this stuff myself as far as bias and things of that nature. I'm still getting stuff out of me just like we all are. Now, I want to start this podcast by quoting a sign that this young lady was holding. She was like 3 or 4 years old. And the sign says this: "We said Black Lives Matter. We never said only Black Lives Matter. We know all lives matter, but we just need your help with Black Lives Matter, for Black lives are in danger." And that's a message that the Black Lives Matter group is trying to communicate. Not that Black lives matter more, but Black lives matter equally. And through history, we have seen that Black lives haven't mattered equally in the eyes of the people who are creating the laws, in the eyes of the people who are in power. And so I thought it was really important to give a historical context of everything that happened, which I'll do. And I'm also going to talk about how Black people are seen as a threat. I'm going to talk about the problem with policing and also what we can do. Now, this stuff didn't happen in a bubble. There's a historical context of the outrage. Whenever you see family members that don't get along, you have to look at their history. You can't just look at what's going on. You have to look at the family history. When nations don't get along, you have to look at the history of those nations, because all of that comes into any conflict that happens. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how Black lives didn't matter historically. Slavery, Jim Crow, you've learned all about that in school, hopefully. I won't talk too much about that, but the purpose of Jim Crow was to keep the status quo, to keep things the same. And for 100 years, that's what it did. And the civil rights movement, once it started happening, understand that there are people fighting for the rights of African Americans, but there are people fighting on the other side just as strongly to keep things as they were. Now, one way that Black lives were considered not mattering was lynching. Lynching is when an angry mob grabs somebody without any sort of due process and they kill them, oftentimes hanging, but not always hanging. Now, in the South, there was 4,084 lynchings from 1877 to 1950. More than 10 years after the Civil War ended, there was 4,084 lynchings in the South. And if you ever look at those pictures of lynchings, they're more like a block party, right? It's not like an execution. It's a block party. There was vendors there. Thousands of people showed up. I remember seeing a picture when I was younger of a 10-year-old that was just standing next to a charred African-American man's hung body. And it was just bizarre. That showed what disregard they had for these people, that they didn't really see them as people, because I don't think you would really stand next to a body of another man who's been burned unless you have taken away his humanity. Here's the thing about lynchings. You could get lynched for anything. You could get lynched for anything, and you could get lynched just for accusations. You could be lynched for being wealthy, which a lot of African Americans who were lynched for having wealth. You could be lynched for speaking disrespectfully to someone. You could be lynched for not moving off the sidewalk. I mean, you could be lynched for basically anything. In those 4,084 lynchings, there was only a 1% conviction of a crime, and not necessarily even murder, just a crime. And when that officer had his knee on George Floyd's neck and he killed him, people looked at that and they remembered all of those lynchings and they said, this is a modern day lynching, which it was. All right, so another way that Black lives were considered unimportant was the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service started giving Black men placebos for syphilis. So they weren't actually giving them medicine, but they were telling them they were. And it was called the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. In 1947, penicillin was found to be able to cure people of syphilis. Well, guess what? They continued to give those placebos to those men when they could have given them the cure. They allowed Black men to die. They allowed them to go blind, to go insane. And the plan was to keep doing it until all the men died. But what happened was in 1972, a whistleblower tried to expose it within the government. It didn't work. And then he went to the press, and the press put it on the front page of Time magazine and a bunch of other places. And the outrage shut down the experiment. So the outrage in 1972 shut down the experiment, not the government. That's important to think about. I remember I saw this on a movie called Mrs. Evers' Boys. I was watching it on TV when I was a teenager, and my mind was blown that the U.S. government could be involved with something like this, but they were. All right, so there's also a lot of history with the criminal justice system in creating this thing called prison industrial complex. So prison industrial complex is basically we keep building prisons and we keep sending people off to prison. And it's this big industry. And here's some numbers real quick. In 1970, there was 357,000 people in prison. In 1980, there was 513,000 people in prison. In 1990, there was 1.2 million people in prison. In the year 2000, there was 2 million people in prison, and in the year 2020, there is 2.5 million people in prison. And a lot of this comes from the war on drugs and the war on crime, and there is a very insidious element of corporations making money off of incarcerated people and private prisons taking place. And to show you how big of a problem prison industrial complex is in America, we have 4% of the world's total population. We have 25% of the prisoners in the world. We imprison more people than communist China. We imprison more people than anybody in the world. So let's go back to the war on drugs real quick. The war on drugs created unfair sentencing for African Americans. And they did it like this. In 1986, there was a law passed, and they created this ratio of the cocaine to crack ratio that got you a 5-year sentence. So in order to get 5 years in prison, you had to have 500 grams of cocaine to get a 5-year sentence, but only 5 grams of crack cocaine. I'm going to put that in today's dollar numbers. You had to have $50,000 of cocaine to go to prison for 5 years, but only $500 of crack. Well, how did this affect African Americans? Well, African Americans were primarily more prone to sell crack because that was the drug of choice in their neighborhood because of a lot of the poverty, which I'll get into in a second. And the people who sold cocaine were not African Americans primarily. They were whites and other minorities, but it wasn't primarily African Americans. To get a 10-year sentence, you had to have a kilo of cocaine versus 10 grams of crack. And once you had this amount, once you had one of these amounts of drugs, there's this thing called mandatory minimums. And a mandatory minimum means that you are mandated by the federal law to get a certain amount of jail time. And the judge had no discretion on this. Now, here's the thing. In predominantly African-American inner-city projects, there are no job opportunities like there are in the suburbs. When you're a young man or a young woman in the suburbs, you can go work at the grocery store, you can go work at like Arby's, so on and so forth. But in inner city communities, those jobs are taken by adults. So there are no jobs for young people in those areas. Now think about this for a second. Let's say you're a young African American male and you live in this housing project and all you want to do is help your family. You see your mother struggling to pay her bills. You see your family struggling to pay their bills. And you say, I want to help my family. I don't know how, but drug dealing can make me some money and I can help contribute and maybe even get out of this place. Now, I'm not saying that it's right, but I am asking you to just be empathetic, to think about the obstacles that are in their way and why people turn to drug dealing, right? I'm not an advocate of drug dealing. I think drug dealing is terrible, but there's a reason why people do these things. So here's what happened. From 1986 all the way up until the year 2010, this was the law of the land. In 2010, Congress passed the Fair Sentencing Act, and it was signed by President Obama, which brought the ratio from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. So for 26 years, African Americans were thrown in jails for long terms, and it finally changed, but that was only 10 years ago, y'all. And this is a clear message to African Americans during this time that their black lives did not matter. They can sit in prisons for long chunks of their life, and who cares? That's the message that the lawmakers were delivering. And here's the thing, it's not just about being alive, but it's also about their standard of living. Another thing that's related, African American communities are over-policed. We saw this with Eric Garner when the cops were harassing him for selling cigarettes, which they're cigarettes. Who cares, right? I mean, like, you should be busting real criminals. Also, in Ferguson, out of the 21,000 residents in Ferguson, 16,000 of them had arrest warrants. And a lot of them were for motor vehicle violations, but some of them were for things like having grass that was too high or having unpaid parking tickets. You should not have a warrant out for your arrest for parking tickets. That's not a crime. I mean, I guess everything's a crime if that's a crime. Over-policing in African American neighborhoods. Now, the city council of the city of Atlanta saw this. They realized that it was a problem, and what they did is they took marijuana and they basically decriminalized it, where they said if you're found with marijuana, you're going to get a $75 fine instead of the possible 6 months in jail and the $1,000 fine, because what they saw is that marijuana possession arrests affect African Americans significantly more. You are 4 times more likely as a black person to be arrested for possession of marijuana, even though the usage between blacks and whites is about the same. Think about that for a second. So African Americans are being affected significantly by the criminal justice system. And once you get into the system, once you become a felon, you lose a lot of rights. You lose your right to vote. It's hard to get a job. It's hard to get an apartment. You can't get student loans. So much is shut down for you that the likelihood of you going back into prison, you committing crimes and going back into prison, is really high, because sometimes people feel like they don't have a choice. And so recidivism is really high. People commit crimes because they don't know what else to do, because they can't get a job, and then they end up going back to prison. And a woman named Michelle Alexander wrote a book called The New Jim Crow that really talks about this and how it's taken away so many young black people's rights. Now, like I said, it's not just about life and death. It's also about the standard of living. That is important. Now, there's this thing called redlining. Now, redlining is basically, the long and the short of it is, in 1934, the Federal Housing Authority was established to help people to purchase homes. But what ended up happening is they refused to insure mortgages in and near African American communities and neighborhoods. And they drew a red line around those neighborhoods. And also, in white neighborhoods, there was a thing called a covenant that said you can't sell your house to a black person, and that was in the contract of the home purchase. Fast forward, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. After that, the Fair Housing Act was passed. And when it was passed, what ended up happening is white people fled to the suburbs. It's called white flight. And the black people were stuck in the cities. Now, because of this, black families have a lot less wealth than white families. Because when you purchase a home, you can make a lot of money in the rising price of the home. You don't always make money, but if you play it right, you can make so much money. I have a friend who bought his house for $90,000. It's worth $700,000 now, just 10 years later. You can make a lot of money in purchasing a house. But because African Americans did not have access to that, they have a fraction of the wealth of white people, even when they have more income. Now, how does redlining affect African Americans besides wealth? Well, the schools in the suburbs are significantly better. The health of African Americans are affected significantly more because of the fact that black communities are closer to industrial areas and being exposed to pollution and a lot of other stuff. So here's another example in history where black lives didn't matter and a reason why people are upset about how they've been unjustly treated. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, oh yeah, but that was all a long time ago. None of that really has an effect on people now. Well, guess what? It does, because recently in 2014, a city by the name of Flint, Michigan, was a red line community, which means it was predominantly African American. And in 2014, what they did is they switched their water source from the Detroit water system to the Flint River. Well, guess what? The Flint River is polluted. The water is undrinkable. People started getting lead poisoning. People started getting sores all over their body from bathing in it. I know a young man who's been affected by it, and it has affected his life significantly. Mentally, he's not the same as he was before. And this was happening to an entire city of people, predominantly black. And it got so bad, it made nationwide news. And then 15 city officials and state officials were indicted. And the Republican governor of the state of Michigan ran a report, and the report said systematic racism was definitely a factor in this happening. So here we are, 2014, 2015. This is recent stuff, y'all. And these are reasons why African Americans are so upset about what has happened, because it continues to happen. All right, so moving on to my second topic, black people being seen as a threat. Now, when I was in high school, I was at a high school basketball game. It was my high school. We were in the playoffs, and we were playing Southwest DeKalb. Now, I went to a predominantly white school. Southwest DeKalb was a predominantly black school, and it came down to the wire. Their star player, our star player, squared up at the top of the key. Their star player shot a three-pointer at the buzzer. He made it, won the game, and that was that. So here's what happened. One of the kids from Southwest DeKalb went up to a group of white kids, and he did what normal sports fans do. They get crazy. They go, wow. He was like in their face. And he was like, yeah. But it wasn't like he was like right in their face. He wasn't touching them. He was just being a jerk. That's what he was doing. Here's what happened. As soon as he did that, a white police officer grabs him, slams him onto the bleachers, throws his hands behind him, and cuffs him. And I'm sitting here watching this. I'm with my friend Frank, and we're just like, what the heck is going on here? Here's what happened. He was seen as a threat. He was seen as a threat by this police officer when he wasn't a threat. He was just being a jerk. And that's the experience that happens oftentimes with African Americans. Now, as an Asian American, I've experienced my fair share of discrimination. But I'm never thinking to myself, oh, my life is at risk. Oh, my non-criminal actions could get me killed. But black people oftentimes are seen this way. Racial profiling is a real thing. Ahmaud Arbery, they thought he was a criminal. They thought he was a robber. I don't know if y'all saw this video, but there was a guy, an African-American guy, who was just going to his apartment late at night, This woman starts asking him all these questions. She starts following him, asking if he really lives there. And by the time he gets to his front door, he opens it. It's clear that he lives there. And it's clear that she was just racially profiling him. This happened to John Crawford. He was the guy that had the BB gun on his shoulder in Walmart, which was an item that was sold in Walmart. The police were called on him. The police shot him dead. But all he was doing was shopping. This is such a common experience in America, and I'm sure other places as well. But it's such a common experience that young black men get this thing called the talk. Once they start, going through puberty and they start, growing, the talk is this: you will be perceived as a threat. You will be perceived as a criminal. You will be perceived as dangerous, and you have to be mindful of that, and you have to carry yourself in a way that other people don't have to because of these assumptions. And if you don't, you will end up possibly getting shot and killed like Tamir Rice, who was just a kid playing with a toy gun, but he was perceived as dangerous and criminal, and the cop shot him dead. Now, think about this. We have video of many things, but think about all the times that there was no video. We convict these people because there was a video, but oftentimes there isn't. And it's hard to get a conviction when it's one word against the other in these instances. Now, recently, Michael Jordan just made a pledge to donate $100 million over the next 10 years towards organizations that fight against racism towards black people. Now, Michael Jordan is famous for two things, more than two things, but he's very, very famous for being competitive, and he's also very famous for being cheap. Michael Jordan, by nature, is not a generous person. But he's donating to this cause because this cause could save his sons one day. This cause affects him directly. Nobody knows what Michael Jordan's kids look like. And so he's donating because even as he is the most famous athlete in the world, even as he is a billionaire, he can't protect his family from this. Now, Jordan has gone on record of saying that when he was younger, he hated white people. And the reason why is because of all the racism he dealt with as a young person. I remember hearing a story where he was in the swimming pool. He got into the swimming pool, and all the people in the pool jumped out of the pool and ran away because they didn't want to be in a swimming pool with a black person. That was his life. And things aren't as bad as they used to be, but African Americans are still seen as a threat. All right, so the next topic I want to cover is police brutality. Now realize this, there's a complicated relationship between the police and black people. And the reason why is a lot of things, but number one, police were originally in the South created to be slave patrols. Slaves were seen as property, not people, so their job was to round up slaves and keep slaves in place. And even after that, for the next 100 years, Jim Crow basically made African Americans second-class citizens, and the police were used against black people during the civil rights movement. You've seen the videos, you've seen the pictures. And because of that and many other things, there is a complicated relationship between the police and the African American community. And part of that has to do with excessive force. Now, Rodney King was a man who was beaten excessively by the LAPD. And what ended up happening, long story short, is those 4 officers who were all white ended up getting off. They did not get convicted. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And in 1992, LA exploded with riots. And it wasn't just about Rodney King and what happened to him. It was about the historical things that happened with LAPD and the black community, and also the black community and police in general. Now, here's the thing about police. The police have protection from consequences. Police have unions that fight for their rights, and they fight for the rights of bad officers. And that's why Derek Chauvin, who shouldn't have been a police officer by the time he ended up killing George Floyd, was still a police officer because of the unions. The unions will always fight for the police when they get in trouble, and even when they get fired, many times they get their job back, or they move to a different district and they continue to act poorly. Here's a statistic on police violence. There are roughly every year 1,000 police shootings that end up in death, and 99% of the officers are not charged. And of that 1% who are charged, usually they don't end up getting convicted, and very rarely do they end up serving jail time. So, excessive force. Excessive force looks like a no-knock warrant on Breonna Taylor's apartment that ended up having her with her dead by gunshots. That's excessive force. No-knock warrants are a bad idea unless they are to capture somebody who is incredibly dangerous and should be reserved for those who are wanted for murder and other super serious offenses. And beyond that, they went to the wrong house. Her and her boyfriend were not even engaging in any kind of drug dealing. Excessive force. Excessive force looks like Freddie Gray given a rough ride in the back of a police van. And excessive force doesn't just come from white officers. Many of those officers were African American who were charged in that situation. The Atlanta tasing incident that just happened, same thing. That's excessive force. Eric Garner being choked out, I can't breathe, that's excessive force. And excessive force is one of the main grievances of the African American community. Now, when I was a kid, I was watching a movie called The Karate Kid. And there's this guy named Johnny and Daniel-san, the main character. They end up fighting, but then Johnny beats him up. And then as he beats him up, he has him on the ground and he's kicking him. And at one point during this interaction, one of Johnny's friends steps in and he says he's had enough, Johnny, and he gets between him and Daniel-san. And that's what people want the police to do. They want the police to stand up and say, hey, he's had enough. Hey, stop using excessive force. Hey, you might kill him. What the community wants, what people want is for the police to police each other, because at that point, there's no one else to call. If someone does something to me, I can call the police. When the police do something to somebody, there's nobody to call. And because their oath is to protect and serve, that's what they have to do, even if it means going against their own colleagues. All right, so how can you be an ally? How can you be an ally to African Americans? And how can you be an anti-racist? Now, I'm happy to say that I'm very encouraged by the diversity at the protests. I'm very proud of the people that I'm friends with on social media, taking a stand for the Black Lives Matter movement. And I hope this supporting of each other continues. But as I say this, it's important to understand that African Americans can be racist as well. Asian Americans can be racist as well. Hispanic Americans can be racist as well. All minority groups have racist people in them. And knowing that all races have racist people in them, if you see an African American being mistreated for the color of their skin or for any other reason, you got to take a stand. And same goes for Asian Americans, same goes for Hispanic Americans, same goes for white Americans. If you see a white person being mistreated because of the color of their skin or being mistreated for any other reason, you got to take a stand for them, because that's just part of being a good human being. And this is my perspective on the matter. One of the problems I have with people of color, whether they're Asian American, Hispanic American, African American, or any other group, and just people in general, is oftentimes people care about the discrimination and hatred that's directed towards them, but they're kind of apathetic about the discrimination that happens to other groups. Now, here's the thing. I got to say this. If you only care about causes that affect you, you are not an activist. You are a narcissist. Okay? You're a narcissist. You got to stand up for other people. You have to be an anti-racist. And know this, racism is not a white issue. It's a people issue. But the thing about it is, in America, white people have the majority of the power because they created the system. The system was created by Caucasians to benefit Caucasians. The system was created a long time ago, but that's the way the system was set up. Black people were brought here for one reason and one reason only: to make white people money. And even after slavery was abolished, the sharecropping system with tenant farming, that was still set up to make white people wealthy. All right, so how else can you be an ally? How else can you be an anti-racist? You can take a stand on social media. You can post things that are supportive of the causes. You can march nonviolently. If you choose to march, by the way, please practice social distancing, wear a mask, and be careful out there. I'm not against people marching, but I am against people getting sick. So please be careful as you march and be mindful of the pandemic that we're still in. How else can you be supportive? Support Black businesses. Why is this important? Because when African Americans get economic empowerment, it leads to them getting a seat at the table. And when you get a seat at the table, when you have money in America, you can advocate for changing laws, and that can make Black people's lives better. Another thing you can do, you can put your money in Black-owned banks. And what Black-owned banks do is they are more likely to give business loans and home loans to African Americans, and both of those things can help to create wealth. And that does the same thing as supporting Black businesses, is it helps them to get a seat at the table and also to help change laws and get better treatment. I myself have moved a bunch of my savings into a Black-owned bank, and you can do that with your savings as well. Another thing you can do, you can support nonprofits that support criminal justice reform, fight against racism, and fight against voter suppression. What else can you do? Go out and vote. Make sure you vote. Voting is so important. We have an important election coming up in November. Please vote. Also, another thing you can do is you can get woke. Read books and watch movies that will help open your mind to what is actually happening out in the world. I'll put some links in the show notes with recommendations. I highly recommend the documentary 13th. I recommend this NPR video about redlining. And even though I haven't seen the movie Just Mercy, a lot of people are saying really good things about it. So definitely check that out. Also, have conversations with African Americans and just listen. Have conversations with marginalized people in general and just listen and learn their experience. Try to develop some empathy about what they've gone through and what they're going through. Also, if you are a student in a high school or college, advocate for a more complete history at your school. Ask your teachers to give you a better education of all the things that really happened. And if you know any teachers, tell them to promote a complete history of what really happened throughout history. Now, I will say that the history that's taught now is a lot more complete and a lot better than it was 10, 20 years ago. But there are still a lot of things that aren't talked about. Another thing you can do, don't ingest racist content. Now, what does that mean? That means there's certain movies, if you know that they're racist, don't watch them. Maybe there's an Instagram influencer who says some pretty racist things. Maybe you need to unfollow them. But don't ingest things that reinforce racist ideas. Now, Dave Chappelle, who is one of the greatest comedians of all time, had this show called The Chappelle Show. And he had 2 seasons that were super successful to the point that Comedy Central gave him this huge $50 million contract. And after he signed it, he realized that the stuff that he was making was actually hurting African Americans. And because of that, he quit his show, he gave the money back, and walked away from all of that success. Now, that was a really awesome thing that Dave Chappelle did, and it's a good example for us to follow as we make our decisions in our life. Also, speak to your family and your friends about racism. I've had to have a lot of conversations with my family about racism. There are times that I didn't speak up that I wish I did, but there have been some really confronting conversations that have happened, and that has to happen because here's the thing. Your family members may not interact with people of color, or they may be a part of a minority and they don't interact with people besides people that look like them. So you have to have that conversation with your family members, and you have to stand against racism and try to educate them and try to change their minds. Now, here's what I want to end with. I used to have a roommate shortly after I graduated from college who was kind of crazy. Like, there was something wrong with him. He was not a kind person. There was just some bad stuff with him. And there was a lot of times where we had conflicts. Well, after living with him for about 6 or 7 months, I was hanging out with a third friend of ours who had known him for years, and it came up in the conversation that my roommate had been sexually abused. Now, once I learned this, I was very, very much more compassionate towards my roommate, and I just had a lot of empathy for him. And also, as I was around him, I became very mindful of my language, of the things that I said, of the things that I joked around about, because I didn't want to say anything that would trigger him to think about the stuff that he's been through. Now, as I say that, we all should be empathetic during these times. We all should be mindful of the things that we say. And I'm not saying that being African American is as bad as being sexually abused. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is, in the same way that you are mindful of people's pain when you know someone who's lost a loved one, or you know someone who has been abandoned by one of their parents, or you have a friend who's overweight, or whatever the case may be, in the same way that you are mindful of what you say around them, try to be mindful during this time. Try to be thoughtful and try to build bridges. And as we engage with other people in that manner, I think a lot of inner healing can happen, and we can understand each other, and we can make connections with each other, and we can make a lot of progress, and we can spread love, and we can extinguish hate. All right, so that's all I got on this topic. Thank you so much for listening. Please take care of yourself. Please take care of others. And please be an agent for change.